Today we celebrate the feast of Christ the King, or feast of the reign of Christ. It's a very, not just comparatively, it is a very new festival. It's a festival that was only put into the liturgical calendar in 1921 by Pope Pius. And that was an interesting time. It was a time when the kingdoms of Europe were dissolving. The Kaiser had gone, the Tsar of Russia had gone, and gradually they were withdrawing from the governance of Europe. And so it was at that point that Pius recognized that something needed to be said about the centrality of everything that the Feast of Christ the King has become. And so he marked it as to be celebrated on the last day of the last Sunday of the liturgical calendar. Next Sunday will be the first Sunday of Advent, the first Sunday of a new year. It's a feast that reflects on the end of things. It'll trickle over into next week in the lectionary, but the end of the eon, end of the world, no, it's the end of a season in the long history of God's dealing with his universe. But the themes of judgment, you hear them this morning, sheep and goats. And by and large, Anglicans don't like a lot of judgment. We leave that to people like Ian Paisley, and there's a lovely story about him. He was the leader of the Protestants in Ireland, in Belfast. And apparently one morning he was preaching, and he was preaching about judgment. And where it is a place you will go, there will be a wiping and a gnashing of teeth. And an old lady put her hand up and said, "Mr. Paisley, I haven't got any teeth." He said, "Teeth will be provided." But we're speaking of Christ the King. What kind of king are you talking about? If Christ is king, if God is in control, how is he doing? And you look to Israel today, the agony of what's happening in Israel and Palestine. Words fade us. Or you look to what's happening in other parts of the world. The same thing can be said. So what sort of job is Christ the King doing? The better question is not what sort of job is he doing, but what sort of king, what kind of king is Christ? I think you have to go principally back to that earliest part of the Christian tradition in the Gospels, the Passion stories, because they're the ones that were the first that sort of were prominent in Christian proclamation and in Christian writings, and of course we find them in the Gospel. And the Passion story is a story that you find in all of the Gospels. It's different in each Gospel, slight differences and big differences in others. And that's because the Passion, the story of the Passion, is like a great precious gem of a stone, which you can hold up to the light, and every time you turn it, you get a different view, you get a different message, you get a different aura. So too is the Passion story. But all of the Passion stories have four parts: the agony in the garden, the trial before the high priest, the trial before Pilate, and the death on the cross. And just in a couple of brief strokes, how does that work? Because that is a story, the Passion story, the Passion drama unfolds gradually, but it unfolds with God withdrawing gradually but decisively through it all. Let us look for a moment at the garden. Jesus has now finally come to that last moment. The last moment when he goes out from the Last Supper. He goes across the Kidron Valley and he goes up onto the Mount of Olives. And there he takes his disciples and asks them to pray with him. And he takes Peter, James, and John and asks them to come with him. And you know the story. They fall asleep. But in that time, Christ is experiencing the withdrawal of God, even his Father. The one with whom he is one is now no longer accessible to him. A slow, gradual withdrawal. And in the garden, that's where he prays. The others have gone to sleep. He prays to God, Father, Abba, let this cup pass. And this is the cup that he spoke of to the disciples, where Peter, James, they wanted to be, when you come into your kingdom, can we assume positions of authority and power? And Jesus asked them, can you drink of the cup that I shall drink? And they say, of course, that's no sweat. Jesus now faced in that dramatic moment in the garden, it is Jesus who is asking, Father, if it be your will, Abba, Father, if it be your will, let this cup pass. And it doesn't pass. And then he is arrested. And he goes from the garden into the home of the high priest and the Sanhedrin. They're the advisors to the high priest. He's gone there. He may have gone there before, because I believe, and it's not important, but I believe it, I believe that Peter, James, and John, their father, Zebedee, he was a priest like Zacharias, who served for a period of time every year in the temple, did his duty, his round, and that he had a pied-à-terre in Jerusalem, and that is where they had the Last Supper, in that home. That's why John, who is he is going to be sitting next to Jesus as the host for Jesus. And you see, if he was a priest and he was well connected as he was, he would have known the high priest. And so certainly the disciples would have gone to that house and stood in the garden and even gone inside. And so too probably Jesus. And so it's in that garden of a house where Jesus has been taken inside. And Peter, how does Peter get in? Well, he's known, as we're saying. He's familiar, and they sort of know him. And that is where Peter 3 times denies Christ. I never knew him. Who is he? But the maid persists, and 3 times he denies Christ. And Christ sees it and hears it, and as they say in the Gospels, the cock crows. You see, God is withdrawing from Christ. The next is when he leaves from the garden to the high priest, he now goes before Pilate. And while the high priest's setting is soft with a garden and a little fountain and some water and some stream, a bucolic, a lovely spot, when he goes before Pilate, you're going into an armed barracks where everything is metal. And he's taken in and goes before Pilate. Pilate then hands him over to the soldiers. And when he gets there, he is stripped. He is beaten. And he is mocked. Withdrawal is taking place. The final phase is he is taken out to the cross, where, as we know, he dies. But how does he die? He is called God, Abba, for right the way through. He tells his disciples, when you pray, call God Father. Call him the Good Shepherd. But now, when he speaks from the cross, it is not Abba. His last words are, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. That is the language that Jesus used, Aramaic, not Greek. But when they came to write the Gospels, those words had so burnt into the minds and souls of those who followed, they never changed it. He's now calling God by a formal name, because the God whom he has served and known has withdrawn. My God, why have you forsaken me? And in Mark's Gospel, for example, it's at that point, and he gives up the ghost. At that point, immediately we hear that the stones were rolled away, there were earthquakes, the veil of the temple was rent in twain. And the centurion said, "This man is the Son of God." That's how the drama unfolds. Yeah, God is withdrawn. But to the centurion, the first to declare, this is God's Son. So what kind of king do we have? You see, it's not if he's doing well, it's what kind of king is Christ. And so when you look at Gaza or the Ukraine and places like that, when you look at that, where is God? And the answer is, God is there. Christ is there. If you want to know where Christ is today, he is in Gaza. He is here. And you will find him there on that cross. Heavy words, messages from the Gospels, from the Bible, from the church. But it's very easy to hear them and say, oh yeah, well, let's go off and have a little lunch now. And someone who lived in, he died in 1945. He died at the age of 39. He was murdered in a Nazi prison camp. His name was Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Bonhoeffer was a brilliant theologian, but it wasn't just a theology out there. He was actually living through the passion and agony of what it was to bear witness to Christ in that kind of situation, in a prison camp. A prison camp where he would be taken out, just as the guns of the Allies could be heard not far away, stripped naked and hanged. But when he was in prison, he wrote quite a bit, letters and papers from prison and things like that. But one thing that he wrote was one of the things, I think it's in the in his sermons, his writings on the Sermon of the Mount. He talks about God's grace, which we take for granted. It's just a nice word. But Bonhoeffer was living and needing and feeding off the grace of God. And he says this. He talks about cheap grace. Cheap grace is the grace we bestow on ourselves, the preaching of forgiveness without requiring repentance, baptism baptism out of church discipline. Sorry, I can't read with my glasses on. Baptism without church discipline, communion without confession. Cheap grace is grace without discipleship. Costly grace. Costly grace is the gospel which must be sought again and again, the gift which must be asked for, the door at which a man must knock. It is costly because it cost a man his life, and it is grace because it gives man the only true life.